All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest of our Get Some Sun webinars. I'm Rosalind Jackson with Vote Solar. Before we dive into the good stuff, a few quick housekeeping items. First, I wanted to let you all know that we will be recording today's presentation, so be sure to check back on the Vote Solar website within the next couple days for that file. Second, we will have a Q&A session with our speakers following their formal presentation. You can ask a question anytime during their presentation by just entering it into the question box on your webinar toolbar, and we will get to those later in the hour. All right, with that, let's get started. We're here today to talk about PV system pricing trends. As I'm sure most of you know, solar's high cost once really relegated the technology to the status of luxury item for the do-gooder wealthy, others willing or even required to pay more for that cleaner power. That's quickly changed over the past few years. A dramatic drop in prices has brought us to a new era in which solar technology costs are no longer a major barrier to scale. And of course, market needs and opportunities have changed apace. Today we'll hear about those changing solar price dynamics from two esteemed researchers from our national labs. With me are Galen Barvos from the Electricity Market and Policy Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and David Feldman, a solar technology analyst from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. With that, I'll hand it over to Galen and David to tell us more about recent price changes and what comes next on the path to low-cost PV.
All right, great. Thanks, Rosalind. So this is Galen Barbos here, and Dave and I are going to do a little bit of a tag teaming, and I'm going to get us started. I'd like to start just by thanking all of you for being here. We're really happy to share this work. The material that we're going to be going through here represents a synthesis of several related and ongoing research activities that are underway at LBL and NREL, and which all relate to tracking and analyzing PV system pricing trends. This is actually something that we've been pulling together on an annual basis. This briefing. The original genesis was actually really to provide DOE, our funders, with a summary document that integrated these various different research activities that they were funding and kind of helped to explain any differences between the sets of numbers that were coming out of these respective efforts. However, we quickly realized that this also might be something that could have broader interest in that it really seeks to provide a fairly broad perspective on PV system pricing trends, both by virtue of covering different time periods, the past, present, and future, and also by integrating some different methodologies and ways of kind of specifying those prices. I should also mention that this briefing has just been published today as an NREL document, and we've got a URL at the end of this presentation where you can download the presentation in addition to listening to the webinar that Vote Solar will be posting. Let's see, David, you're driving. Let's go to the next slide here.
Sorry, some slight technical difficulties. I'm just making sure. Okay. Sorry about that. There you go.
There we go. All right, actually, you can go to the next one after that. So I gave a bit of background on kind of the genesis for this work. The overarching motivation, of course, is that there is an ongoing need for reliable and comprehensive information on PV system pricing trends for all the reasons that Rosalind mentioned. And this document really seeks to kind of fulfill that need. As I also mentioned, this work integrates really three separate ongoing research activities at the two labs. The first, and the one that I'm going to talk about, is LBL's annual Tracking the Sun series, and that report focuses on historical trends and is based on a very large data set of installed prices that are reported for individual systems. And so just last month we issued the 6th edition of Tracking the Sun, And that report focuses primarily on systems installed through year-end 2012. And that's the data that we'll be covering here as well. The second piece of research covered here is NREL's ongoing bottom-up cost modeling work, which is led by Al Goodrich, Ted James, and Michael Woodhouse at NREL. And David's going to cover that material, and we'll explain a bit further what it entails. And then finally is the work that David himself conducts in synthesizing a wide range of market and industry data. And he does this for a set of quarterly reports that he prepares for the DOE Solar Program. And importantly, one part of those quarterly reports involves integrating forward-looking projections of PV system pricing and component pricing from a bunch of different analysts and industry sources, and that's what we pull together into this briefing. Next slide. Next slide, David.
Oh, I think it's just taking a little while to buffer, but it's
okay.
I have it on the.
All right. Well, the next slide. Here we go. It just has a bunch of numbers which basically summarize the installed price data derived from the 3 different research activities that we'll be discussing. We'll actually be going through each of these elements in turn, so I won't really go through this now. But we've included it here just for reference so that you can kind of see all the numbers in one convenient location. Next slide. So the next slide here, this is basically just sort of a graphical version of the previous slide where we've integrated the 3 different analyses into a single figure. And again, we'll go through this, sort of each of these 3 pieces in turn, so I'm not going to say a lot at this point. There are, however, I think 2 bigger picture themes that I'll mention here. All prices have fallen quite significantly over time, and that analysts project continuation of those trends going forward. And then the second kind of larger theme is in comparing the historical price data, the reported system prices, with the bottom-up modeled price numbers. You can see that in some cases they agree quite well. In other cases they don't agree for reasons that we'll talk about later. And the reasons for those discrepancies are really kind of important things to keep in mind in general just as consumers of information, and things to think about when one comes across sort of benchmarks and is sort of forced to think about what do these mean and how are they derived. And so David will talk about some of those issues as we move forward. So next slide. Okay, so I'm going to really run through the historical data here, which, as I mentioned, comes from this Tracking the Sun report series that we put out each year. Next slide. So this data is, as I mentioned, it consists of project-level data reported for individual residential, commercial, and utility scale systems. This latest edition of Tracking the Sun really primarily covers systems installed through year-end 2012. There is a single figure, however, that will contain some sort of preliminary data for the first half of 2013. Throughout this section of the presentation, we distinguish between residential and commercial PV or distributed PV on the one hand, and utility scale PV on the other, and I'll kind of walk through the historical trends for those 2 different sectors separately. In terms of the sources of data, for the residential and commercial or distributed PV, those data come primarily from state and utility PV incentive programs. For this latest edition of Tracking the Sun, we had 47 such programs that contributed data, and those programs span 24 states. The utility scale data is a bit more varied, and it comes from kind of really the set of sources listed here. So, FERC Form 1s, a bunch of data from the Section 1603 grant program database, company filings and other sorts of SEC and regulatory filings, and just sort of a whole miscellaneous set of sources. there are a couple sort of, well, there are many sort of data cleaning steps that go into preparing this data for analysis. I just want to mention one here, and it's a bit of an esoteric issue, but it does turn out to be somewhat important. And that's that within our data set, there are, of course, both customer-owned systems and then third-party owned systems where the PV system is installed on a residential commercial rooftop but is actually owned by some separate entity that then either leases the system back to the site host or sells the power to the site host under a power purchase agreement. And for some subset of those third-party owned systems, the install price data that are reported to the incentive programs are actually some kind of appraised value rather than an actual transaction price. And so for that subset of third-party owned systems, we've actually kind of scrubbed them out of the data sample and excluded them to the extent that we could identify them, just because we felt like that those data were not really comparable to what was being reported for customer-owned systems and for kind of the other third-party owned systems where there is an actual kind of intermediate transaction. So that's a potentially important thing to keep in mind for those that are delving into the weeds. As far as the data sample itself goes, after all of the cleaning and scrubbing was done, we had a set of about 200,000 individual PV systems, and that represents about, I guess, 65% of all grid connected PV capacity installed in the U.S. through 2012, and about 50% of the 2012 capacity additions. Next slide. So I'm going to, as I mentioned, kind of first focus on residential commercial PV, and then in the latter part of this section of the presentation, I'll provide some data on utility scale. So this figure here presents the long-term installed price trend for residential and commercial PV systems. In particular, we're showing the median values in each year for each of the three system size ranges shown. And then the blue line at the bottom is a global module price index, which is something that Paula Mintz has developed. Several key takeaway points here. The first is that you can see over the entirety of the historical period, installed prices have fallen quite considerably, with an average annual decline of about 6 to 7% per year. However, you can see that those price declines have occurred to some extent in fits and starts, where you can see, for example, a prolonged period from about 2004 through 2008, 2009, where there was very little movement in installed prices, and that time span corresponded to a period when globally PV demand was ramping up very rapidly and was outstripping the capacity of suppliers across the value chain. And that was, for example, when we saw a big surge in prices for raw polysilicon. Since 2009, however, you can see that there has been very precipitous decline in installed prices. And you can see by comparing those top three lines to the blue line on the bottom that those declines in overall system level installed prices have really been driven primarily, though not exclusively, by falling module prices. And before moving on, I do want to sort of stress two caveats to this figure and to similar sorts of figures that are out there. The first is that what we see in this figure are median values. These are central tendencies. And as some of the following slides will show, there's just tremendous variability around those medians. And then the second thing to note here, and somewhat related, is that the data sample is pretty heavily dominated by California, just by virtue of the fact that the overall US PV market is heavily dominated by California. And as we'll show in a few slides, California is a relatively high-cost state, which then, of course, tends to pull the overall sample median for the US as a whole upward. Next slide. So the previous figure focused only on systems installed through year-end 2012. We are, of course, now in September 2013, and so one might reasonably wonder what has happened in the intervening time. And so to give some preliminary indication there, the figure on this slide compares the installed price of systems completed during the first half of 2013 to the price of systems installed throughout 2012. And here we're focusing just on data from the California Solar Initiative program. And so what you can see is that installed prices in the CSI program have continued to fall quite significantly over the first half of this year by basically about 10 to 15% depending on system size. And so to the extent that these trends here for the CSI program are representative of the rest of the country, and to the extent that they hold up throughout the remainder of the year, then we'd actually be on pace to exceed the installed price reductions witnessed last year for the entirety of 2013. Now, there are some mitigating factors, namely that module prices have begun to stabilize and even creep upwards in some markets. However, there is often a bit of a lag between movements in module prices and installed system prices. And so there's still maybe some residual system price reductions based just on the declines in module prices that have occurred up until this point. And then, of course, non-module costs may also continue to decline, and to the extent that happens, that will sort of further enable continued reductions in system-level price, system-level installed prices. Next slide, please. So as we would expect, installed prices exhibit economies of scale with respect to system size, and we see that in the figure here, which focuses just on residential and commercial projects installed in 2012, and which shows median values and the 20th and 80th percentile ranges for each of the size bins shown here. And so not surprisingly, what we see is that there is a continuous decline in installed prices as system size increases, as we'd expect. The one kind of interesting thing to note, though, is just how rapidly those returns to scale diminish, where we can see that median prices drop off quite quickly at the small end of the size spectrum, up to, say, about maybe 5 kilowatts or so. But then the economies of scale, they continue after that point, but they really taper off pretty dramatically. And then I think the other last thing that I just mentioned with respect to this figure is the percentile bands give you some sense of just the wide variability in pricing that exists, as I alluded to a couple slides ago. Next slide, please. So the U.S. PV market is quite fragmented into really a large number of regional and state and even more kind of localized markets, and that fragmentation occurs both by virtue of just the large geography of the U.S. as well as due to the tremendous variation in policy and regulations from one place to another. And so the figure here helps to reveal the impact of some of these geographical differences in PV market conditions by breaking apart the data by state, focusing again on 2012 systems, and in this case looking specifically at systems in the less than 10 kW size range, so kind of the smaller set of systems. And here we see quite substantial variation across states. This cross-state variation potentially reflects a whole host of different factors. One specific hypothesis that has often been proposed is that prices could be higher in states that have higher incentives or higher retail electricity rates if installers are able to value price their systems. In other words, charge customers based upon what the customer is willing to pay rather than based on what the underlying costs are to the installer. In addition to kind of that potential factor, which is something that we're actually beginning to look at in a bit more depth and detail, there are, of course, a bunch of different other differences across states related to underlying costs, things like labor costs, permitting and other kinds of administrative costs. Differences in sales tax can actually be surprisingly significant. and depending upon whether sales taxes are whether PV systems are subject to state sales tax and what those sales taxes actually are, that can end up adding up to, say, about 40 cents per watt to the installed price of the system. And then beyond the sort of value-based pricing issues and the underlying cost differences, there are simply differences related to the size and the maturity of the market, where we'd expect larger markets to have lower prices just by virtue of having greater competition and greater efficiency, perhaps more bulk purchasing by the installers active in those markets, and maybe better access to lower cost products perhaps. Interesting though, that last hypothesis is not altogether obvious in the data, where you can see that the largest state market, California, is kind of way over on the right-hand side and has relatively high prices. Now this, of course, doesn't mean that market size doesn't matter, but just that at least in the case of California, there are some other factors that appear to dominate. And then my last point on this slide is really just to note that even though we see quite a bit of variation across states, the figure also shows an equally, if not greater, amount of variability within each state. And so it is important to, although one needs to recognize these cross-state differences, to not also overemphasize them and to see them as sort of part of a larger set of issues that drive variation in PV system pricing. So the next slide here really is just sort of shows something similar to the last slide, variation in installed prices across states, but in this case just focusing on systems larger than 100 kW. And so really kind of the same basic story here, where we see pretty significant variation across states and within states. Next slide. And so everything up until this point has been focused on residential and commercial systems. I'd now like to just quickly run through some historical data on utility scale PV systems. First, just a few methodological points. For the purpose of this work, we've defined utility scale PV to consist of ground-mounted systems larger than 2 megawatts in size. And so that may or may not be the same kind of definition that is used elsewhere, and there's no real magical reason why we used it in our case other than just kind of for convenience and practical reasons. But that's something to consider, especially because that means that we have some number of systems in our utility scale data set that are perhaps relatively small compared to what people typically think of as being a utility scale project. And then the other sort of sample definition piece here is that we only consider projects where all phases were in operation by the end of 2012. So no projects where just there was sort of an individual phase or a set of phases that were online. There are a number of caveats to the utility scale data, which I've listed here. I won't really kind of mention these or read them through, other than just to perhaps highlight the first one, which is that we're dealing with a relatively small sample size here, at least compared to the residential and commercial PV data set, and so one has to be somewhat mindful of that. Next slide, please. And so here we see essentially all of the individual utility scale systems in the data sample, where we've organized them by year, year of completion along the x-axis, and then group them according to system configuration type. Looking initially just at the 2012 data, we can see the capacity weighted average installed price for each of the three system configuration types, and those were $3.35 for crystalline fixed tilt, $3.60 for crystalline tracking, and then $3.23 for thin film with fixed tilt. Again, those are central tendencies, and you can see here that there's quite a bit of variability around those averages. Looking at sort of the time series here, it can be a bit difficult to really discern a meaningful time trend, just given the small and relatively diverse sample of projects here. Just focusing on the crystalline fixed tilt system, the orange circles, we can see the capacity weighted average prices fell quite substantially over this period by about $2.80 a watt. but that those price reductions slowed pretty considerably within the last year of the analysis. In comparison, looking at the thin film systems, the blue triangles, we see that the capacity weighted average install price has actually really barely changed at all over this period, and in fact were slightly higher in 2012 than during the initial period. And so putting those two time trends together for thin film and crystalline fixed tilt systems, you can see how much more competitive crystalline systems have become over the past 4 or 5 years as the price of crystalline modules has fallen so dramatically. Next slide, and I think this is really the last one here. The utility scale systems in the data set include a wide range of system sizes. As I mentioned, the lower bound cutoff was 2 megawatts, and then the largest system in the data set is 60 megawatts. And that range in system price and system sizes to some extent helps to explain the overall variability in pricing that we observe. And so to help visualize that, the figure in this slide just breaks apart the 2012 systems based on system size. And so you can see, for example, that the projects larger than 10 megawatts are much more tightly clustered within a price range of basically about $2.50 to $4 a watt. In comparison, the smaller projects, less than 10 megawatts, they're actually in general sort of clustered within the same range, but then they have this long upward tail where say about 20% of the systems are priced above $4 a watt, and there were even a few in there that were above $5 a watt. And so the bottom line, I guess, is just that much of the overall variability that we see for the utility scale PV data set as a whole is really associated with these relatively small utility scale projects. And then the last thing I'll note here, that the figure really just kind of helps to reinforce some of the relationships that were observed on the previous slide with respect to differences in system configuration type. And in particular, you can see that the crystalline systems with tracking, the green X's, are not surprisingly somewhat higher priced than their fixed part crystalline counterparts, and that's evident just by virtue of the fact that those green X's are generally above the trend line. So with that, we can forward to the next slide, and I'm going to hand things over to David, who's going to talk about the two NREL elements in this briefing.
Great. Thanks so much, Galen. I appreciate it. So the first section I'll be discussing is sort of in contrast to the reported pricing numbers that Galen summarized, which is we'll be discussing bottom-up cost analysis, which is a sort of a different way to look at system pricing. So detailed cost models for specific PV system designs were built by NREL to determine the individual cost components contribution to total system cost, as opposed to looking at a reported figure of the total system. Analysis was done to look at each cost added up and come up with a total system price from there. So each individual cost components were compiled from numerous industry and primary sources for costs incurred by both the manufacturer and any installer. They were then validated by various manufacturers and installers, and this sort of dialogue was created between the modelers and the industry participants to gain greater specificity and also to get feedback of the results. So the categories covered in this analysis include material, labor, overhead, profit, land acquisition when appropriate, preparation costs, land preparation costs, regulatory costs, pretty much everything up to the point of grid tie-in. So this bottom-up price benchmark also keeps the fundamental system characteristics constant, and by that I mean sort of, we're for a residential system, we're pretty much looking at the same type of residential system in each year, And the purpose of that is to track sort of the underlying cost changes consistently over time to get an idea of the underlying cost trends as opposed to potential variability in system design. So when adding this all up, all these things up together, I think the best way to compare the results is something similar to an installer quote, or the what's sometimes referred to as the overnight capital cost of a system for a given time period. So looking at slide 18, we're going to be focusing on 3 bottom-up cost models that were built. The first is a 5 kilowatt rooftop residential system. We're also looking at about a 200 kilowatt rooftop commercial system, and finally an approximately 180 megawatt fixed access utility ground mounted system. So there is somewhat size variability within from year to year, and that's really based off of the given module efficiency for a given time period. So as modules become more efficient, it's assumed that for a given area of land or roof space, you're able to put more watts in that area. So the results are summarized in 3 basic buckets: module, inverter, and balance the system, although the underlying results or the underlying cost information is more detailed, as I discussed in the previous slide. So based off of these benchmarks that were created, from the last quarter, and I'm sorry, I should sort of back up a second. The benchmarks were done for the last quarter of each year, so Q4 2009, Q4 2010, and based off of these past 4 years, there was a capital cost fell between 14 and 18% on average per year, and that's approximately 50 to 75% of that reduction was caused by a drop in module pricing. Looking at just the past year, from Q4 11 to Q4 12, or the most recent two benchmarks, the overnight capital costs actually fell between 53 to 61 cents a watt, or 13 to 23%. And of that, 32 to 42 cents a watt was from module pricing. Looking at the utility scale benchmark for a second, it should just be noted that the size was, the 180 megawatt size was chosen to more easily correspond with EIA pricing benchmarks and sizes. So the EIA does a benchmark each year, and for various reasons, it's beneficial for DOE and NREL to have an idea of sort of a counterfactual. So that's why the very large size was chosen. However, it should, and there is in fact, as our model shows, efficiencies of scale, as we can see here. So if we look at a 5 megawatt model system to 185 megawatt system, the costs fall approximately 22 to 26%. But I think it's important to note that most of this savings, so about 72% of these savings, are achieved once the modeled system reaches 20 megawatts. So while we're modeling 185 megawatts, it's not too dissimilar from a 20 megawatt utility scale system. In this next section, we'll be comparing the bottom-up model prices that I just summarized with the reported prices which Galen summarized in the first section. So before I go into this analysis, I should also mention that when we compare the reported numbers to the benchmarks, for the fourth quarter 2011, we compare that with 2012 numbers, and the reason we do that is because we feel like the shift in time allows us to compensate for the time lag between an actual price quote and an installation date. So as we can see on the left side of the graph, looking at the residential market, the median reported U.S. price of $5.30 a watt is about $1.10 a watt more than the modeled overnight capital cost of $4.20 a watt. However, it should be noted, as Galen discussed, there is a range of prices in the U.S. marketplace, and the median reported price varies dramatically by state. So if we look at the if we compare the overnight capital cost of a residential system to that of the median reported price of Colorado, they're actually very similar. This is also true if we look at the commercial space. So again, if you just look at the median reported price across the U.S. of $4.60 a watt, so it's much higher than the modeled overnight capital cost of $3.20. But if we compare the median price from Colorado to the modeled number, they're very similar. If we're looking at the utility scale market, there is again a pretty big gap between that capacity weighted average utility scale price of $3.40 a watt to the modeled number of $2.50 a watt. But some of this can be explained when we sort of narrow our focus to reported prices greater than 10 megawatts. However, there is still a gap. So why is this? Well, there are potentially several reasons to explain these differences. First, there's just this basic difference between price and cost. So if we think about price, that's reflective of what a customer will pay for a system, or what basically the market will bear. So there are several reasons why a customer may purchase a system for significantly more than they would elsewhere, regardless of any underlying costs such as module or inverter cost. Among them are things that Galen discussed in the first section, such as electricity rates within a region, greater incentive programs, which actually lowers the cash outlay by a customer, but the price paid to the installer may be that much higher. There's also barriers to entry within specific market, which keeps competition low. If we compare, so there's median reported, or if we compare that sort of the price to that may vary to the bottom-up benchmark costs, those are really reflective of consistent, transparent assumptions of costs with representative margins regardless of market conditions. So if an incentive level increases or decreases, it's not actually going to affect the modeled number, but it certainly would have effect on the reported price. Another reason why the two methodologies might produce different results is timing. So the reported price generally reflects underlying module and component pricing at the time the installation contracts were signed, which could precede the installation date by more than a year, especially for large projects. So in contrast, again, the bottom-up benchmark costs are contemporaneous with the subcomponent pricing estimate. So it's really a price quote. So all prices sort of happen at the same time, and therefore there's no lag. So we attempted to compensate for that lag by comparing the Q4 benchmarks to the following year, but that time shift may not fully capture the lag between price quote and installation date. There are also geographic location differences which might affect price. The report price method is weighted, obviously, and it's heavily focused on high installed areas such as California and New Jersey. The bottom-up benchmark is really based on national averages of stuff like labor and margin and whatnot. So there could be differences there. Finally, project specifics actually have a large impact on system price. And this happens in the residential, commercial, and utility space. So the modeled systems don't fully capture all the specifics that could go, variations that could go into a model or a project. They're really representative of one sort of example of what a system would look like. So there are things that could change price, such as high efficiency panels, the difference between a commercial facility and a government facility, and the difference between a relatively small utility scale project, something that's only 2 megawatts, versus something that's 100 megawatts. So all of those reasons could have a large impact on price, and could go a long way to explaining the difference between reported price and these modeled benchmarks. Moving on to the next section of the NREL analysis, we're going to be looking at near-term future pricing trends from basically a collection of various analyst estimates across the PV space. So if we look at this first slide, is really a comparison of residential and commercial PV systems prices in Germany to those in the U.S. As we could see, install prices in U.S. are quite high compared to Germany, about $2.61 to $2.68 a watt lower in Germany than across these three size segments than in the U.S., which represents about 51 to 56% reduction. So this is pretty consistent with other analysis looking at U.S. prices compared to international PV markets, which in Tracking the Sun 6 has a section on this, looking at smaller systems. But there's clearly a difference in the U.S., a higher power price compared to other markets, and a lot of this has been attributed to the difference in soft costs. So what does this have to do with near-term pricing? Well, this is at least suggestive that there is potential near-term cost savings in the United States if it can take lessons learned from other countries, notwithstanding any structural difference between the U.S. market and other international markets. If we look at slide 26, this is the median price of across various analysts for module price over time and in the near-term future. So if we look from 2008 to 2012, module prices actually fell on average 35% a year. Now, in the future, analysts have a mixed forecast of what module ASP will be from now until 2014. They vary between 50 cents a watt and 75 cents a watt. It should also be noted that most of these projections happen in the first quarter of 2013, before the EC and China brokered a module and component pricing floor. So this doesn't even take into account that there might, at least for some markets, be a limit to how low module prices can actually go. Regardless, analysts do not expect a major increase or decrease in module price. So if we sort of think about how this will impact system price, this really means that there's not going to be any major system price reductions from PV module price alone, as there were in previous years, and as Galen highlighted. So moving on to the next slide. Conclusions. Oops, sorry. slide 27. This slide shows the range of analyst estimates and projections for global average system price in both the distributed and utility scale space. So there's pretty, as you can see, there's a pretty wide gap in projections between high and low, and that's mostly caused by different areas of focus for a particular analyst projection. Notwithstanding, most analysts.
Hey, David, I'm sorry. Sure. Hey, I'm just not seeing the that slide on my screen. I don't know.
Okay. Oh, great.
It's just still loading.
That's the. Let me just make sure. Can you see it now, or?
Yep, I see it.
Great. Fantastic. Thanks, Caitlin. I would have gone to the end, and you guys would have been on a different slide. So, appreciate it. So again, this slide is looks at the analyst estimates of price projections for both distributed systems and utility scale systems, and it's sort of the average system, pretty much the global system price. We tried really to look at mostly U.S. system projections, but just because of the nature of analyst projections, there's some amount of global weighting of sort of analyst pricing. So just to sort of summarize again, as we can see, there's a wide range in pricing between the high and the low pricing, but even with that wide gap, all or most analysts have both distributed system and utility scale system pricing going down in the near future. And so distributed systems are expected to reach between $2 a watt and $4.75 a watt by 2014, and utility scale systems are expected to reach $1.50 a watt to $3.15 a watt by 2014. So in the near term, they're expected to continue the system price reductions. Conclusions. So there are several key takeaways from our research activities discussed by Galen and myself. First, based on several different methods of analysis, so both the research that Galen summarized on reported pricing and the research that I discussed on bottom-up benchmarks, I think it's safe to say we conclude that the system price reductions continued to fall in 2012, and more is expected in the near term. So despite any tensions or trade issues. Reported system pricing fell 6 to 14% from 2011 to 2012 in the reported numbers, and based on the overnight capital cost numbers, between Q4 2011 and Q4 2012, costs fell 12 to 23%. So, but despite this general downward trend, there are large variations in reported pricing within market segments in 2012. There is roughly a $2 a watt difference in the median installed price between the lowest and the highest price state for residential and commercial systems less than 10 kilowatts. But similar variability also exists within an individual state as well. In addition, ground-mounted systems greater than 2 megawatts range in price from $2 a watt to $6 a watt. We can also see differences in results between the reported pricing methodology that Galen summarized and the bottom-up benchmarked methodology in 2012. So in the residential market, the median reported price was $5.30 a watt, while the bottom-up benchmark overnight capital cost was $4.22 a watt. In the commercial sector, the median reported price was $4.62 a watt, while the bottom-up benchmark was $3.22 a watt. And in the utility scale space, the capacity-weighted average reported price was $3.35 compared to the model number of $2.50 a watt. So we discussed some of the differences, some of the reasons that this difference could be caused by, such as inefficient pricing, timing, geographic location, and individual project specifics. So with that, I think unless Galen has any other conclusionary remarks, I think we can open this up to audience questions.
Great. Anything more to add, Galen?
Nope, nothing from me. I guess, David, yeah, there you go. Here's the URL for the briefing if folks are interested in downloading a copy.
Great, and I'll be sure and send this URL around in the follow-up email that you'll all receive as well, so that you don't have to copy that URL down if you don't want to. So thanks so much, guys. I will, just highlight again from Vote Solar's perspective, we've been doing policy work since 2002, and we are very much at a new phase in solar market growth here in the U.S. As a result of these PV pricing trends you've described, our own advocacy focus has really shifted from incentives that kind of bluntly brought down the price of solar to programs and regulations that really target those remaining soft costs that you mentioned, that continue to kind of broadly expand market access and make sure we're planning a grid that can really take full advantage of all of this new solar that's coming online so affordably. I know that, of course, lowering those soft costs is also a focus of the DOE through the Sunshot Initiative. I'm wondering if either of you are able to tell us a little bit more about what's underway with that program and what the areas of focus or exciting initiatives might be there.
Do you want to? Well, you can. Please, David, you can feel free. You're in Washington, D.C.
Yeah,
sure. I mean, I can speak to a few things.
Sure.
There's a team at DOE focusing on a bunch of different areas, one being finance. So the feeling is that some of the reason that there's high costs in the U.S. versus potential other countries is the high financing cost for these systems. And so there's a bunch of different ways that they're looking at lowering that. One of them being they're funding an effort to help nurture securitization. So one of the things they're doing is funding efforts for more data collection and standardization of documents. There's an effort underway through NREL called SEPSI, which is an industry working group aimed at coming up with standard documents. But all of those things are really intended to get the industry in a mature enough space where investors can look and they're potentially create securitized products to sort of lower the financing costs. There's other initiatives as well in the community solar space. There's a lot of funding there. There's areas for rural initiatives, as well as looking at the utility sector, trying to work with within the utilities to help lower some of those costs as well. So there's a bunch of things they're working on. Galen,
yeah, I mean it's hard to actually put it all in a nutshell because there are really kind of so many fronts from within the Sunshot program. I mean, obviously they've been doing a lot in the last couple of years on permitting processes, working with local jurisdictions to develop kind of best practices there. And I think Rosalind, you guys are, doing a lot in that area as well, and perhaps have been doing some of that with DOE funding. There's an initiative that they launched a couple years ago, I guess, called the Rooftop Solar Challenge, where municipalities and local jurisdictions are really kind of working to streamline their local permitting and regulatory processes. There are a number of sort of there's a kind of incubator program, I believe, where they're funding companies to sort of develop products and services that will help to lower soft costs, really kind of a whole host of things across the soft cost spectrum, I would say. Certainly within the labs, I mean, all of our solar funding work is really in some way, shape, or form soft cost oriented, even this cost tracking work. And so we have a lot of stuff going on right now looking at sort of addressing market barriers that may be causing soft costs to be higher than they need to be. Certainly lots of work in the kind of utility business model space, and making sure that the kind of regulatory frameworks that exist for distributed PV are kind of working for everybody and are sort of sustainable over the long term from kind of everyone's perspective. Gosh, what else? A lot of work just directly with states on policy design and implementation of various kinds, whether it's working with states and localities on permitting processes or working with them on renewable portfolio standard design, or sort of really any other number of things. So yeah, if folks are interested, certainly encourage you to go to the Sunshot webpage. There are a lot of great resources there that kind of give I guess a more comprehensive overview of the suite of activities that are going on than what I can necessarily kind of recall. But there's just a lot going on in the soft cost space right now.
Great. Well, thank you for that overview. We're excited to see those all move forward. Lots to come a long way, and there's still lots of exciting stuff that can be done to streamline and facilitate more solar for all of us. So we have just a few minutes left. I'm going to shift from that macro level picture to one that is very focused on the data you presented, Galen, specifically. Had a question from Carl Segrist. Did the utility scale pricing you presented here account for the differences in land costs, site preparation, transformer needs? Some of those variations that I know David touched on later. I'd love for you to both answer that, and I often get questions about tracking the sun data related to whether or not incentives are involved. So I think a broader statement from you about what exactly you're showing when you show us those that pricing would be helpful.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. So all of the tracking the sun data, both the utility scale and the residential commercial data, these are market data. So these are kind of the reported transaction price. When somebody sells a PV system, what are they selling it for? What are they receiving? So in the case of individual residential system, I mean, the easiest case is a host customer-owned system where somebody installs the system on the customer's rooftop and the customer writes them a check, and then the customer will turn around and get an incentive from the utility or whomever. So in that case, the installed price really reflects how much did the customer pay to the installer, and in all cases it's a pre-incentive installed price. So if one wanted to look at this on a post-incentive basis, you need to take the numbers that we presented and then deduct off the value of the various incentives that the customer receives in order to determine kind of the net upfront cost to the customer. But these are gross costs, pre-incentive costs. And now that being said, of course, as I mentioned, some amount of value-based pricing may exist. So in regions with higher incentives, it's possible that we might be seeing higher prices. That's at this point, I think we have some kind of anecdotal evidence of that, and some sort of rough empirical evidence as well. But we're kind of working on some analysis to really kind of probe that theory in a bit more depth and precision. In terms of whether or not what do these prices include, as far as differences in land preparation costs and so forth. I can't remember all the things that were mentioned there. I mean, they include everything that was reflected in the transaction price. So these are these are transaction prices between a buyer and a seller, and they're going to certainly reflect all of the underlying costs to the extent that the seller of the system is able to successfully negotiate. But as in all transactions, the ultimate price is going to be determined to some extent based on the relative negotiating power of the buyer and the seller. But certainly from the seller's perspective, they want to recover all of their costs plus some sort of margin. And so in kind of a long-term equilibrium with a perfectly competitive market, these reported cost data would include all of those underlying costs and nothing more.
Great, thank you. That was all very helpful. We are at our hour, so with that, I'd like to just thank Galen and David again for their time today. Their great work on the subject in general. We sure appreciate it. Thank you all for attending, and expect to get some follow-up materials from me.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rosalind. Thanks, everybody.
You bet.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.